So William F. Buckley. We're going to talk about William F. Buckley, then move on to other parts. But William F. Buckley, for those of you who don't know, ran a TV show where he would interview people. He was a conservative, so-called, commentator, mainly in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And you can look up old footage of his TV interviews, the people that he talks to. Well, he had on Buchanan, and I want to talk to you a little bit about what Buchanan did. It's worth noting that a big moment for me whenever I started to realize how fake and gay and woke Con Inc. is, including, but not limited to, the Daily Wire, was a moment when I was listening to Michael Malice talk to Michael Knowles. So Michael Knowles, I assume it's just called The Michael Knowles Show. Michael Knowles has a show, and he invited Michael Malice on it. And they were having a discussion. It was a pretty good discussion. The two of them kind of like triggering the libs. It was a funny little conversation. But at one point, Michael Malice brought up Buckley's name in a negative way, and Knowles said, "Really, I really like Buckley." And you could tell from the look on Malice's face that he was really surprised to hear this and said, Buckley is a big villain of conservatism. He was a gatekeeper. He kicked multiple people out of the conservative movement because they were too right-wing for him. Really? And Knowles, I don't even remember what he said back, just something shallow and silly, I suppose. But that's the kind of commentary you get from Michael Knowles. And I've brought this up several times, but I'm bringing it up now because it's relevant. Most conservatives don't realize what I'm about to tell you. So there's a National Review article in 2015 titled Why We Should Recognize Same-Sex Marriage. This is just kind of something Malice brings up to show how the right moves toward the middle, or conservative movement in general. So there's some things that were written here. Buckley basically devoted an entire issue of National Review to an essay lambasting Buchanan titled In Search of Anti-Semitism, which he expanded into a short book the following year. So what does this have to do with? I'm reading the book right here now. Buckley and Buchanan wrote a 1990 New York Post article questioning some aspects of Holocaust history. Nixon went on the air to defend Buchanan, insisting that he's not an anti-Semite, which was fairly indisputable proof that he was. Holocaust denial is far more often couched as Holocaust skepticism, just asking questions, and Buckley was having none out of it. Then it goes on to say what I just told you. He devoted an entire issue of National Review to an essay lambasting Buchanan titled In Search of Anti-Semitism, which he expanded into a short book the following year. This went on, Michael Malice writes, so it was that by 1991, both Rothbard and Buchanan were pariahs in their own way and had nothing to lose. It seemed inevitable that George H.W. Bush would be the Republican nominee again. In the wake of the Gulf War, he had posted approval ratings of around 90%, an unprecedented number. It also seemed rather certain that Bush would be reelected, as no one on the Democratic side had anything close to his political stature. So that is how Buckley treated Buchanan. You know, the more things change, the more they stay the same. Because there's a difference. I really do believe there is a difference between looking at specifics of the Holocaust, saying, okay, how many of these people died of typhus and how many of them died because they were murdered or just killed because they were in combat, things like that. Because a number of people in the Russian army were Jewish. Not really that many, very few. You see way more people in leadership in the Communist Party of the Soviet Union that were Jewish than you do actually see foot soldiers, but there were some. But it's one thing to ask questions about, okay, how many of them died of typhus and what were the actual numbers, and do some history, do some deep digging and some reading. But it's impossible to do so when you live in a culture, when you live under a regime that smashes you down and says you cannot question anything. Oftentimes, we're told here on the right that the Nazis stopped all political discourse. that the Nazis were censorious, that if you dare to say anything they didn't like, you were questioned or arrested or sent to a work camp or killed. And yet, when you look at the regime we live under right now, when you look at the gay race communist regime we're under, the liberal progressive new world order that we're living under, it sounds a lot like a regime that we were told about in our history class when we covered World War II. We're often told this is what fascism and National Socialism are, when really, when you put on the they live glasses, you realize, no, we're actually living that right now. If you say the wrong thing, you get fired. If you say the wrong thing, you can get debanked. Mark Andreessen has talked to Joe Rogan about that. Now, of course, I believe in the Bible, blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. There are people that are evil, who are provocative for its own sake, who do things like tell 1488 jokes in poor taste. Not to say that we can't have a dark sense of humor and laugh about it as a joke, not as something that we hold to as, oh, this is truth. But there are people in bad taste that should be condemned and not really taken seriously because they're just kind of these edgelords on Gab or even some of these edgelord types on Twitter. But when you look at this book I read just a bit ago, these are Michael Malice's words, there is fairly indisputable proof that Pat Buchanan was an anti-Semite. And this is more name calling. This is just more stuff that is just the same. This is one of the reasons I don't really call myself like a Michael Malice anarchist, and I am not an anarchist of any kind or a libertarian of any kind, but I don't particularly consider myself an admirer of Michael Malice. I think he can be very funny, but it's also not particularly surprising he's going to say this, because all you got to do is look up Michael Malice's heritage. Yeah. So with that being said, that was the interaction between Pat Buchanan and William F. Buckley, how he was treated. Now, this is something else that I wanted to cover. We're going to now move on from Buckley and talk a little bit more about Buchanan. So Buchanan, in his book, and the reason I'm bringing this up is because Malice actually talks a lot about Buchanan here. Malice is very critical. Excuse me. 1 second. Malice is very critical of Buchanan. He doesn't like the fact that he has the views that he holds to on immigration. And there's not really any good reason given, I will add. There really isn't. Whenever you read this book, you will ask yourself, okay, Malice, I understand that you disagree with Pat Buchanan's views on immigration. But why? What is your positive case for the alternative? The only thing you can sort of say would be, all right, well, are you just saying to basically listen to people smarter than you? People like, oh, what's his name? Brian Kaplan, who I don't agree with when it comes to immigration at all, but he's a smart guy. He's an economist, and he makes his case for open borders, and you could agree with it or disagree with it. Of course, I strongly disagree with it. But Michael Malice doesn't actually make cases. I mean, he says some things to critique Buchanan, but doesn't actually make the positive case for why we should basically have no government-controlled borders and allow multiple people to come in here. So I wanted to read this part. This is in, oh boy, let me find the chapter of this part of the book. So this is, okay, almost there. Sorry, guys. Chapter 9 of the book. Death of the West is a book that Pat Buchanan wrote. I actually have it. Michael Malice says here, as such, it's very hard to critique a right-wing book that is actually crackpot, simplistic, and outdated without sounding like a leftist. I want to pause here and say that Michael Malice's critiques of this do sound like a leftist, and you're going to see what I'm talking about. To continue with what Michael Malice is saying, yet Death of the West, again, this is by Pat Buchanan, is all those things to a great extent, combined with spot-on analysis and insight. Like so much else of the new right, it's very much a mixed bag. To begin with, Buchanan repeatedly uses a trick to make claims without taking the responsibility of making them. The use of rhetorical questions that are anything but. This is a quote from Buchanan. Is Western civilization about to follow Linden's empire to the same inglorious end? End quote. Quote, are we in the twilight of the West? End quote. Buchanan wonders. Without waiting for an answer, he quickly assumes the positive and then asks, is the death of the West irreversible? End quote. So let's stop right here. Without waiting for an answer, Michael Malice says, he quickly assumes the positive and then asks, is the death of the West irreversible? You will find, though, even in the course of this chapter of The New Right by Michael Malice, that Pat Buchanan is making his case. He asks, are we about to follow Linden's empire to the same inglorious end, and are we in the twilight of the West? And Malice said, well, now you're assuming it's true when you say, is the death of the West irreversible? Well, Pat Buchanan makes his point, and a lot of it is declining birth rates. And he goes on to continue to write about this, and I'm going to read it to you. But American birth rates have not gotten better, they've gotten worse. I mean, I've talked to you guys that the numbers used to be 3.4. The numbers now are 1.9. Now, if every couple in America, if every man and woman married has 2 children, one man, one boy, and one girl, and let's just say they both grow up to get married, do some basic math. That's basically replacement immigration, assuming that they grow up, they get married, and they have children and have 2 more. Okay, we're now treading water. We're not swimming under, but we're treading water, which is not really good. We need to be having more children to grow our population. But that would be replacement. But 1.9 means there are some that are only having 1. And again, 1.9 is the average. There are several having 1 child or 0. And then there are some that are having 3, 4. I mean, I'm in a family of 4. I know people who are in a family of 10. There's some people I know who have a family of 18. They have 18 children. And this guy is impregnating this woman 18 times. And she keeps having children. And God bless them. I think that's a wonderful thing to have a lot of children. This is not at all saying that anyone should force anyone to have children or to have more than 1 child. But it's something that is worth looking at and asking, why are we having less children? And I've talked about this before in the past. I talk about this in my review of Michael Warren Davis's book. I really do believe that some of it is economic. I don't think it's only cultural. I definitely think that abortion is in a lot of ways to blame. I think that a culture of me and I and my is also a problem. Oh, I need to do what I want, and I'll have children later when I'm in my 30s, and I can only have 1 or 2 before I basically have no more fertility. That's a bit of a different situation. You know, that's one thing. But I do believe that there's an economic angle of the man cannot just work 1 job and make enough money to feed his family. He's got to work 2 minimum, sometimes 3, for the wife to be able to stay home. And in many cases, what they end up doing is he works his job, she goes out on maternity leave, has her children, or her 1 child in some cases, puts the child in daycare, and then goes back to work so that they can make ends meet. That is a problem. That's something that I want to talk about, as I've said to you guys, more this year, the economic problems of this country. I have a lot of interest in trying to figure out what's going on. Why are things so weird with our economy where wages continue to fall? Now, they grew under Donald Trump. That's one thing that a lot of leftists cannot stand, and they really have no data against this. But you can find very easily stats on rising wages, and you will see they rose during Trump's term. They stopped in 2020 for obvious reasons. COVID-19 was terrible for the world, not just the economy in America. So I'm getting ahead of myself, but Buchanan is not building up an argument on nothing. He is making an argument, and Malice is just rejecting it. So let's go on now to actually get into some more of this. So here we go. Michael Malice writes, Buchanan's logic is remarkably similar to that of Al Gore and his global warming associates. It breaks down like this. 1. Civilization is under unprecedented existential threat. 2. The only way to stop this threat from being realized is via a complete reordering of society, which is admittedly impossible. 3. Since our political systems won't allow us to undertake the massive changes that are necessary, we can at least effect incremental changes in the right direction. 4. Said changes won't actually stop the existential threat from being realized, but for some never explained reason we should do them anyway. Okay, we'll stop. I'm going to stop Michael Malice right there, and I'm going to respond to this a little bit. So, civilization is under unprecedented existential threat. It should be reasonable, in many people's minds anyway, half the country, to say that the idea of the world getting hotter on data that is shaky, on data that the man who started the Weather Channel rejects, that is different than the fact that people are having less children at not even replacement levels. One is fear mongering that might actually have some truth to it. There's people like Curtis Yarvin who say that he's what is he called, like a lukewarmist. He thinks that the world is getting hotter, but it's not. It's kind of inconsequential to human life. It's not really going to affect us that much. That's more or less what Glenn Beck says at one point. He talks about all the millions of people that die of hypothermia every year, and says if the world actually does get a little bit warmer, even if it did, it wouldn't be that big of a deal. I really don't believe. I'm full-blown denier over here. I really don't believe that it's actually getting worse. I think it's all a big pattern. That things get warmer, then things get colder. That's my viewpoint on it. So people should be able to see the distinction between, okay, this over here, which has to do with the weather, going to wipe out the human race. Oh no, oh no, no, to the fact that birth rates are declining and that we're not going to have a country, we're not going to have a nation if people stop having children. If people go from having 1.9 to 1 or 0.9 or 0.5, meaning the rate drops down so much the average is 0, but then there's some outliers who have like 5 or 6, and that brings it up a little bit. And then most people only have one kid only. You know, if numbers continue to fall, we will have a collapsing population. That is a fact. When we look at the numbers, things have gone down with the population and the number of kids people are having. So Michael Malice is trying to draw a false equivalency. He's looking at an apple and an orange and saying, well, they're both fruit, when he should be saying, no, these are two different things completely. All right, so point two, this is back to the book. This is what Malice is saying, Buchanan is saying. The only way to stop this threat from being realized is via a complete reordering of society, which is admittedly impossible. So 2 and 3 go together. Let me go ahead and read 3. Since our political systems won't allow us to undertake the massive changes that are necessary, we can at least effect incremental changes in the right direction. Okay, part of when you stop being a boy and grow up to be a man, in other words, when you stop being a libertarian and move toward the right wing, is realizing how politics actually work. This is one issue, and I try not to do too much right-wing infighting here, but this is one issue that I sort of have with Curtis Yarvin. Curtis Yarvin, in his discussion with Christopher Rufo, said a lot of really good things. I probably agree a little bit more with him on certain things than I do with Rufo. I don't particularly like either one of them as far as do I consider myself a mold buggy, and no. Do I consider myself a Rufo, and no, I don't. But at the same time, there were things that Yarvin said, which is you've got to just change your whole paradigm of thinking. You're not becoming radical enough, Rufo. There's an element of that is true. Where I would have problems with Yarvin is he does have the mindset. Rufo pointed this out correctly. Yarvin has the mindset of if you do anything to fight this monster, they'll just beat you. And so Rufo says, I see that this as like a excuse for inaction, because your lesson that you're teaching your listeners is when you fight your enemies, they win. And so what logic are you supposed to come to? What conclusion are you supposed to come to other than, well, then just don't fight? And then the other thing that Yarvin says is we basically have to just take over everything, somehow have a dictator come in. And I don't mean even dictator in a negative way. I mean like a king come in here and just sweep everything away, fix everything. And that in the meantime, any kind of incremental change doesn't really do anything, because he critiques the incremental change that Rufo makes. In reality, I think you can take some of both. I think that we need to have some small changes. You have to start somewhere. There has to be some incremental change. You have to walk before you can run. And what's an example of this? It took years of these pro-life organizations talking and talking and talking. And I'm sure countless meetings that they spent with Donald Trump. And then what happened? I mean, you're talking about ever since Roe v. Wade came about. But then what happens? All their hard work eventually paid off. All their time spent with Donald Trump. And eventually he chooses Supreme Court justices. He's looking at them and saying, you know what? I'm going to choose this person, this person, and this person. And what do? They get in there and they overturn Roe v. Wade. You have got to move in small steps first. You have to. The idea of one day we're going to just snap our fingers and everything, like, with Thanos' gauntlet, is just going to melt away all our problems, is fantastical. And so, this is the thing. So now we're looking at 3 and 4. So let's look at all 3, 2, 3, and 4. The only way to stop this threat from being realized is via a complete reordering of society. Again, I'm reading Malice's words about Buchanan, which is admittedly impossible. Since our political system won't allow us to undertake the massive changes that are necessary, we can at least effect incremental changes in the right direction. Said changes won't, this is 4 now, said changes won't actually stop the existential threat from being realized, but for some never explained reason, we should do them anyway. So the 4th one, here is where Malice is right, and here's where he is wrong. So where he is right is a lot of people make incremental changes, very small ones, and that's enough. They are content to stop right there. This is part of the problem with conservatives. Conservatives will get into office, lower taxes. They may do a little bit on foreign policy that's marginally better than what the Democrats are doing, maybe if you're lucky. And then they just are content to be right there. Say, well, we reversed a little bit. We're making incremental change, and we're content to stop right there. They won't stop. What it needs to be is exponential. Incremental change squared, incremental change squared, just on and on and on. It needs to be exponential. Because what happens, it's like a snowball. That snowball is going to get bigger and bigger and bigger. And so he is right when he says these changes won't actually stop the existential threat from being realized, but for some never explained reason, we should do them anyway. So the reason we should do them anyway is because that's a starting point. Slowing down the car from going off the cliff is not a bad thing. So the whole thing about, conservatives are progressives driving the speed limit is correct. Conservatives are not nearly enough. I cover this in depth when I read The Reactionary Mind by Michael Warren Davis and review it, and also acknowledge The Stupid Party by Clyde M. Wilson, and go on to say that I no longer consider myself to be a conservative because it's not good enough. So those are legit critiques that these people are just driving the speed limit. But before you stop the car, at some point when you press the brakes, you are going to drive the speed limit. If you're going 90 and you press the brakes and you're in a 55, at some point the speedometer is going to say 55. But you don't stop there. That's the difference. The conservatives say, we're going 55, we're good. Whereas we want to not only stop this car, but put it into reverse. We want a turning back of the clock here on the right. So we've got to start somewhere. And so this idea, this straw man of, we should do them anyway, even though it won't actually stop this. Well, if you reverse things from being, the birth rate, from being 1.9, you bring it to 2.9 or 3.9, you are moving in the correct direction. Now, where does it need to hover? It needs to hover above replacement levels, really, and probably well above that, so we can continue to grow and have a big population of European-descended old stock Americans. So let's go on into now a little bit more. I wanted to cover those 4 points Malice makes that are really straw men, trying to conflate two things that are completely different. And let me continue.